Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Glenn Holland. Saturday's movie is Father's Little Dividend at 8 p.m. on WQLN PBS. Like its predecessor, Father's Little Dividend was directed by Vincente Minnelli from a screenplay by Albert Hackett and Francis Goodrich, using characters from Edward Streeter's 1949 novel, Father of the Bride. The primary cast is the same as well, with Spencer Tracy, Joan Bennett, Elizabeth Taylor, Don Taylor, Russ Tamblyn, Billy Burke, Maroney Olson, and Marietta Canty reprising their roles. Like Father of the Bride, Father's Little Dividend begins with upper-middle-class family man Stanley Banks sitting wearily in a chair in the living room of his home. Speaking directly to the audience, he begins to recount the events of the past year since his daughter Kay married Buckley Dunstan. In the wedding's aftermath, Stanley is feeling happy and confident, sure that with Kay married and his two sons soon to be out on their own, it's time for him and his wife Ellie to begin to enjoy themselves. When he returns from work one afternoon, Ellie tells him they're having dinner with Kay and Buckley, who have big news. On the way to their apartment, Stanley suggests he and Ellie take a vacation to Hawaii, but she advises they first find out what Kay and Buckley's big news is. Stanley's sure it's about some big business deal Buckley has pulled off. When they arrive at the apartment, Buckley's parents, Doris and Herbert Dunstan, are there as well. The newlyweds make their announcement. Kay is expecting a baby. Everyone is delighted, except Stanley, who is devastated that he's about to become a grandfather when he still feels so young and full of life. Back home, Ellie begins to call her friends to tell them about the baby, while Stanley informs Kay's two brothers, who take the news in stride. The next day, Stanley spends the afternoon at the gym to get back in shape. He has a good workout, but the next morning he's so stiff and sore he can't even get out of bed. Soon, Ellie gives Kay a baby shower that fills the house with female guests laden with gifts, something Stanley considers akin to highway robbery. Later, Ellie has an idea. Since Kay and Buckley's apartment is so small, she and Stanley should remodel their house to provide enough room for the young couple to move in with them after the baby is born. Stanley has no desire to live with the baby full-time and puts his foot down. Soon afterwards, the older Dunstans arrive with blueprints for their own planned house renovation to allow Buckley and Kay to move in with them, and Ellie is inconsolable. But the parents-to-be have another surprise. They've arranged to build a house of their own, and Ellie will have a free hand to help Kay decorate. But inevitably, there will be more trials before they all welcome the baby, especially for Stanley. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's Father of the Bride was one of the top-grossing movies of 1950, earning over $6 million on a budget of less than $1.25 million. The studio quickly bought the rights for a sequel from Edward Streeter, who wrote the original novel. Since the actors, the production crew for Father of the Bride were all employed by MGM, it was a relatively simple matter for producer Pandro S. Berman to gather them together again for the sequel. The only problem was, director Vincente Minnelli had moved on to his new project, An American in Paris, starring Gene Kelly and Leslie Caron. But Berman was adamant the same director who had made Father of the Bride such a success should also be at the helm for Father's Little Dividend. In the end, Minnelli directed the sequel during a break in the production of An American Paris, while the sets were constructed for that film's climactic ballet sequence. Because Minnelli was on hiatus from his other film, Father's Little Dividend was shot on an expedited schedule of only 23 days. As a result, the finished movie was ready to appear in theaters only 10 months after Father of the Bride. In other words, a movie about a family expecting a baby had a gestation period only slightly longer than that of a real baby. Spencer Tracy was less than thrilled at the prospect of reprising the character of Stanley Banks, the father of Father of the Bride, in a proposed sequel, Father's Little Dividend. He would have preferred to tackle the challenges of a new role rather than something he'd already done, and done only a few months before. But Tracy's paramour, Katharine Hepburn, managed to persuade him playing Stanley again was good business for both him and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Despite the close kinship between the two films, there are differences between Father of the Bride and Father's Little Dividend. Most modern critics show a preference for Father of the Bride. But Michael E. Grost wrote in a critical survey of Vincente Minnelli's movie, "Much of Father of the Bride revolves around ugly issues of money, finding a well-to-do husband, spending vast sums on an ostentatious wedding. By contrast, Father's Little Dividend deals with human issues that are nobody's fault. The difficulties of pregnancy and having a baby, and learning to get to know a baby after it is born. It is a warm, sweet film that shows genuinely nice, but not whitewashed, people." One of those human issues that are nobody's fault in Father's Little Dividend is mid-century modernity and the changes it was bringing to the post-war world. For example, when both sets of parents planned to remodel their houses to include room for their parents-to-be and their new baby, Kay and Buckley instead decide to build a house of their own. This reflects the move to suburbia by young couples in their early 50s, and the house Kay and Buckley are building, even in its earliest stages, is clearly more modern in design than their parents' traditional-style homes. Again, both the Bakers and the elder Dunstans are worried about the advice Kay is receiving from her doctor during her pregnancy. Dr. Nordell seems to have all sorts of radical ideas. He thinks mothers should have close physical contact to bond with their infants from birth, rather than handing them off to a nurse, and suggests the mother might even wear a sling of some sort to carry her infant around. The idea. Later scenes of the family trying to interact with their new grandchild through a hospital nursery window serve to remind us just how much ideas and practices surrounding pregnancy and childbirth have changed in the last 75 years. Another indication of changing times. This is a rare example of a Hollywood movie shot while the motion picture production code was still in effect that openly shows a pregnant woman. Elizabeth Taylor's personal life during production of Father's Little Dividend stands in contrast to the happy story the movie tells. Shortly before the premiere of Father of the Bride, she had married hotel heir Nicky Hilton in an elaborate wedding ceremony MGM organized essentially as publicity for the movie. But Taylor soon realized her new husband was abusive, a gambler, a drunkard, and a heroin addict. During one of their fights, Hilton kicked Taylor in the stomach, causing her to suffer a miscarriage just when she was preparing to play a happy, expectant mother. Taylor received a divorce from Hilton in January 1951, 8 months after their wedding. Father's Little Dividend was well received by both critics and audiences. Bosley Crowther, in a review for the New York Times, wrote, "It is not very often that the sequel to a successful film turns out to be even half as successful or rewarding as the original picture was. But we've got to hand it to Metro. Its sequel to Father of the Bride is so close that we'll willingly concede to it all the humor and charm of that former film." With a budget of $941,000, the movie ended up grossing over $4.6 million. Andrea Passafiume wrote in a 2003 essay for Turner Classic Movies, "When Father's Little Dividend became another big hit for the studio, there was talk of making a third installment. But Joan Bennett, who played Mrs. Banks, became embroiled in a scandal. Her husband at the time, Walter Wagner, wrongly believed her to be having an affair with her longtime agent, Jennings Lang. One night, not long after Father's Little Dividend was released, Wagner confronted Bennett and Lang in a restaurant parking lot and shot Lang in the groin. Bennett's career never fully recovered after that, and as a result, there were no more Father of the Bride movies. Well, at least not until the 1991 remake starring Steve Martin and Diane Keaton, which spawned a sequel of its own. Please join us again next time for another Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm Glenn Holland. Good night.